We think we know vampires. They burn to ash in sunlight. Garlic sends them running. They sleep in velvet-lined coffins and can't cross your doorstep unless you foolishly invite them in. This is the vampire we know from movies, books, and TV shows. But what if I told you that most of that is wrong? Not just a little bit exaggerated. Not slightly incomplete. Completely, fundamentally wrong. The version of the vampire that pop culture sold us is a pale imitation of the original nightmare. Tonight, we're not just correcting the record. We're exposing the vampire myths that fiction completely misunderstood, twisted, and in some cases, just plain made up. Let's begin. Welcome back to More Vampires, the channel where we separate ancient myth, timeless legend, and modern fiction. I'm glad you're here because today we're taking a stake to the heart of what pop culture taught us about the undead. We're going to tear down the Hollywood version of the vampire, piece by piece, to reveal the far more terrifying creature that lurks beneath it. First up, the biggest one of them all. Sunlight always kills vampires. We've seen it 100 times. A stray sunbeam hits a vampire's hand, and it bursts into flame. They get caught outside at dawn and crumble into a pile of dust. It's dramatic, it creates tension, and it's a fantastic weakness for our heroes to exploit. But it's a modern invention. In the vast majority of early folklore from around the world, sunlight didn't instantly kill vampires. In many stories, it simply weakened them. It might have revealed their monstrous nature, forced them back to their graves, or stripped them of their supernatural powers until nightfall. The idea of vampires spontaneously combusting under the sun was largely popularized by the 1922 film Nosferatu, which added this dramatic flair for cinematic effect. Before that, a vampire caught in the daylight was just a cornered predator, not a walking firework. The instant death rule was added for drama, not for mythological accuracy. Next, let's talk about their sleeping arrangements. Every vampire needs their beauty rest, and according to fiction, that means a cozy silk-lined coffin. It's an iconic image, isn't it? The Dark Lord rising from his Gothic casket. But again, this is more about spooky aesthetics than historical fact. Coffins are a tradition for the dead, not necessarily for the undead. In the original folklore, vampires rested in all sorts of places. The most common requirement was that they needed to rest in the soil of their homeland. This could mean they simply burrowed into the earth of their own grave, hid in forgotten family crypts, or concealed themselves in dark, desecrated shelters. The coffin became a popular prop later on, especially in the Victorian era, because it was a powerful, creepy symbol of death. It looked good on a stage and read well on a page. It was a theatrical choice, not a folkloric one. And what about the vampire's irresistible charm? The seductive, aristocratic creature of the night who woos their victims with hypnotic eyes and poetic whispers. This is perhaps the most significant reinvention of them all. Let me be clear. Early vampires were not charming. They were not seductive. They were horrifying, bloated, and rotting corpses. They were often described as having ruddy, purplish skin, a result of being filled with the blood of their victims. They smelled of the grave and were closer to a shambling zombie than a suave nobleman. This monstrous image represented the physical reality of decomposition and disease. The seductive, attractive vampire is a much later creation, emerging from the Romantic and Victorian eras with figures like Lord Ruthven and, of course, Dracula. This change made the vampire a marketable anti-hero, a dark but alluring figure. It made the horror more palatable, more psychological, but it was a complete betrayal of the original, grotesque monster. Let us move on to another classic rule, a vampire coup, and enter your home without an invitation. It's a comforting thought, right? That your front door is a magical barrier against the undead. This belief actually comes from a mishmash of different folk traditions. The idea that evil spirits, demons, or even fairies needed permission to enter a private dwelling is a common theme in global folklore. It's a symbolic representation of the sanctity of the home. Over time, this general rule about evil entities was simply applied to vampires in fiction to give humans a small fighting chance. In the original legends, however, vampires had no such restrictions. They were forces of nature, a plague upon a village. They would smash down doors, climb through windows, or seep through keyholes as a mist. They invaded homes freely because that's what a predator does. They weren't polite demons waiting for permission. They were an unstoppable blight. What about our trusty vampire repellent, garlic? A braid of garlic over the door, a necklace of cloves, it's the go-to protection. But why garlic? Well, for centuries, garlic was seen as a powerful plant with medicinal properties. In many cultures, its strong smell and pungent nature were believed to ward off not just sickness and disease, but evil in general. It was a symbol of purity and life, used to protect against all sorts of malevolent forces, from the evil eye to witches and demons. Its association with vampires wasn't exclusive. It was more of a general, all-purpose spiritual disinfectant. So while it was used against them, it wasn't a silver bullet designed specifically for vampires. It was simply part of a larger folk tradition of using potent herbs to keep all forms of darkness at bay. And what of their power? Modern vampires are often portrayed as immortal gods. They're super strong, super fast, and virtually indestructible, with only a few specific weaknesses. They are apex predators. Yet, in many of the old myths, vampires were surprisingly fragile. They weren't all-powerful. Sure, they were dangerous, but they could be trapped by scattering seeds or salt, which they would be compelled to count. They could be bound with certain knots, starved by sealing their graves, or permanently laid to rest through a variety of rituals. They weren't gods. They were parasitic spirits bound by strange, obsessive rules. Their power wasn't in physical invincibility, but in their terrifying ability to drain life and spread corruption. They were a problem that could be solved with ritual and knowledge, not just brute force. Now, let's talk about their diet. Vampires drink blood. End of story, right? Well, not exactly. Blood is certainly the most famous item on the menu, and for good reason. It's visually shocking and deeply symbolic. But in many global legends, the vampire figure didn't just drink blood. They consumed something far more fundamental: life force. Some myths describe them draining the vitality from the living, causing wasting sicknesses without ever leaving a mark. Others tell of creatures that stole a person's breath while they slept, or fed on their psychic energy and dreams. Blood became the main focus in later fiction because it was a tangible, gruesome, and dramatic way to represent this draining of life. It made the act more visceral and easier to depict, but the original concept was often broader and, in some ways, even more insidious. Finally, we have the idea that vampires are inherently evil. They are villains, demons, creatures of pure malice. But in their earliest forms, vampires weren't always seen this way. They were often portrayed as victims themselves. A person might become a vampire because of an improper burial, being the victim of a suicide, or simply because they were cursed. They were not so much morally evil as they were afflicted with a supernatural disease, an infection that forced them to prey on the living. They were a corruption of the natural order, a body that refused to stay dead. This makes the original vampire not a villain to be defeated, but a tragedy to be ended. They were a warning about what happens when the lines between life and death are blurred. So, when you look at it all, modern fiction didn't create the vampire. It redesigned it. It took a terrifying, bloated corpse that reeked of the grave and gave it a makeover. It made the vampire sexier, stronger, cleaner, and ultimately, simpler. The creature became a dark, romantic hero or a straightforward monster to be slain. But the original vampire was something else entirely. It wasn't a hero. It was a warning about disease, about the horrors of death, and about the terrifying idea that some things and some people should stay buried. And maybe, just maybe, that's far more terrifying than anything fiction ever invented. Thanks for joining our deep dive into the real darkness behind our immortal myths. If you want to uncover more truths like these, be sure to subscribe to More Vampires. Because as you're starting to see, the truth is always stranger and often scarier than the legend.